Take Back Your Health Now, Episode 31.
You're listening to the Take Back Your Health Now podcast, the show that interviews the top doctors, athletes, trainers, and entrepreneurs to help you find the Holy Grail of health. Now here's your host, Dr. Dan Margolin.
This is Dr. Dan Margolin with another segment of Take Back Your Health Now, where we pull out all the stops in search of health's Holy Grail. We are very excited today to have a wonderful guest, Nora Gedgaudas. She is a widely recognized expert on what is popularly referred to as the Paleo Diet. She is the author of the international best-selling book, Primal Body, Primal Mind, Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life. She's also the author of the best-selling ebook, Rethinking Fatigue, What Your Adrenals Are Really Telling You and What You Can Do About It. Nora is an experienced nutritional consultant, speaker, and educator, widely interviewed on national and international radio, popular podcasts, online summits, television, and film. Nora, welcome to the show.
Oh, Dan, thanks for having me.
We're really excited to have you here. So talk to us, Nora, what is the Primal Body?
Yeah, well, you know, it's basically based on the idea that we were confronted as an evolving species with a lot of selective pressures along the way, a couple million years ago, that would have basically shaped our our dietary tendencies, and those dietary tendencies in turn would have shaped our physiological makeup and our fundamental nutritional requirements. So,
And those have changed. I mean, I guess with the modern sort of society that we're living in, I assume we're not really living the same way that we used to. We're not eating the same things that we were.
We're not, but genetically, we're all still the same as we were at least 40 to 200,000 years ago. We're fundamentally still, regardless of our ideologies, regardless of our ethnic heritage or anything else, we are all at base fundamentally hunter-gatherer people. And for a very good portion of our evolutionary history, we've been mostly hunters.
And we're I guess we're hunting now when we go into the supermarket and we hunt for that ice cream bar or something like that, but not the same way as we used to be.
Well, right. So the marketing forces that be have taken advantage of a lot of the psychological factors, I think, that constitute our makeup. For instance, we are psychologically still kind of in a feast or famine mentality that our ancestors and any wild being would be. In other words, eat while the eating's good, because tomorrow there may not be enough. And yet,
Right.
Today we have this unnatural access to this unnatural abundance of food and food-like substances. And, we don't have the kind of off switch that we need to have. And particularly since the majority of the foods that are available to us, particularly in the center aisles of the grocery store, are carbohydrate based, which is kind of a first for us to have a carbohydrate based diet throughout, our entire evolutionary history until about 10,000 years ago, when we adopted this thing called agriculture, and things started changing. So did our health at that time.
Now, I've been working out, and I've been listening to like a lot of the bodybuilders saying that you need a certain level of carbohydrates. In your book, you say actually, and maybe I'm misquoting this, but you don't actually need any sugar or any carbohydrates at all in your diet. Am I saying that right? Or
yeah, I mean, so of the three major macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, right? The only one for which there's no established human dietary requirement, I mean, not in any medical textbook, not in any textbook of physiology, is carbohydrates.
Wow.
Carbohydrates that supply us with glucose. It's true of all carbohydrates, but the carbohydrates that particularly supply us with glucose, sugary, starchy foods, are little more than what amount to metabolic kindling for us, right? Your brown rice, your beans, your whole grain, breads and sweet potatoes and things. Those are kind of like twigs on our metabolic fire. And then your white rice, white potatoes, bread, pasta, that kind of a thing. Those are a lot more like crumpled up paper on our metabolic fire. Sweetened beverages and beer and sweetened alcoholic beverages and things like that are pretty much like throwing lighter fluid on our metabolic fires. And if all you have is kindling to run your sort of metabolic wood stove with, I'm from Minnesota, so wood stove analogies work for me. you can do it. And in 99.5% probably of our population right now is doing it just that way. But the problem is, what are you actually doing? You're sitting in front of that metabolic wood stove with the doors open, and you're constantly preoccupied with where that next handful of fuel is going to come from to keep those fires going. And I think of it as a form of metabolic enslavement. Our nature would not have been so stupid as to design us that way, being forced to eat every 2 hours or whatever to keep the fires going. This is a model that serves the interests certainly of the food industry, of big agribusiness, of U.S. Department of Agriculture's food pyramid. No conflict of interest there, right? But This is not how human beings were designed. Well, what's our alternative? What if you are to take a nice big fat log and throw that on the fire instead, right? All of a sudden, you're kind of free. You get to go off and do your thing, and you can sleep through the night. And yes, there is an analogy to be made there. And then you wake up in the morning and, oh, look, the fire's burning down. I'll throw another log on the fire. You're basically
So you're talking about actually freedom based on food.
Freedom based on operating from a fat-burning metabolism, which is, I believe, the natural, and there's ample evidence to support that operating from a fat-based metabolism as opposed to a sugar-based metabolism. We're told that we have to rely on glucose as a primary source of fuel. And it's a very, very misleading statement. It's only true. It's only conditionally true. It's only true if we have metabolically adapted ourselves to a rather unnatural dependence on glucose as a primary source of fuel.
I mean, what you're talking about is really a diet that probably most Americans are actually living on. I saw a staff member eat I swear to God, a Doritos sandwich. It was literally a Doritos chip, I swear. And I was like, what?
Oh my God, there's no hope for the future at all.
I said, that can't be good for you,
No, and the thing is that it's not just about carbs. Obviously, I mean, the food industry has figured out how to tap into psychologists, tap into the brain, into our biochemistry to trigger centers in the brain, addictive centers in the brain. I mean, sugar, for instance, triggers opiate centers in the brain, these pleasure centers, and some people can kind of take or leave sugar, but just like some people can take or leave heroin, but for others, it's like the kiss of God,
Right.
And they don't know how to stop. They just simply, crave this stuff like mad. The other interesting thing is that the foods of agriculture, grains and dairy products, they contain opiate-like substances. Grains contain, gluteomorphin, protonorphin. There's casomorphin in dairy products. And these also trigger powerful opiate centers in the brain that some people just don't know how to manage in any way other than simply becoming addicted to these foods. And I think in some ways that is why we adopted agriculture on such a full scale as we did. I believe we became addicted to these substances. We were forced, at the end of the last ice. We forget that from about 2.6 million years ago, at the beginning of what we call the Quaternary Ice Age, to about 10,000 years ago at the end of the last period of glacial advance that occurred rather abruptly, I might add. We're still in the Quaternary Ice Age, by the way, but we're not in that period of glacial advance. We coexisted with these enormous Pleistocene megafauna. Some of these in excess of 10,000 kilograms. And if we extrapolate, say, one of probably the most popular member of that genre, which is the woolly mammoth, from the body composition of elephants, for instance,
right?
They had over 50% body fat, and we're not even counting roughly 4 inches or more of subcutaneous fat underneath their hides. And in addition to the brain and the bone marrow and the tongue and all of these fatty organs that we absolutely would have consumed everything. We would have consumed all of that. And it was our taste for fat and the fat of these animals, our preferential hunting for these animals throughout our entire history, that is really responsible for the development and the unprecedentedly rapid encephalization of the human brain, our most unique characteristic. So, I mean, I'm basically here to say, and I have a new book called Primal Fat Burner. Basically, and it sounds like a weight loss book, but actually, it's really a double entendre. I'm happy to say that the weight loss part will probably be a favorite side effect that people experience when they adopt this way of eating, if they need to lose weight, that is. But the true definition of being a primal fat burner is successfully adopting a fat burning metabolism. In other words, relying on free fatty acids and something called ketones for fuel instead of a sugar burning metabolism that's wholly relying on glucose, which is, of course, the unfortunate and rather unnatural norm in our society.
So the log burning is basically what you're talking about with the fat, and the very quick light, like a match being lit, is really the glucose. So right now, as a society, we're addicted to this kind of a glucose fast food rush kind of thing. And you're saying we've got to get back to that primal kind of fatty thing. That's really interesting.
So here's the thing to understand, that fat to our ancient human physiological makeup literally means survival. Right? And survival trumps literally everything else. And there's this hormone called leptin that's been much more recently discovered. It was actually discovered being secreted from our very fat cells. So your body's adipal tissue, fat tissue, is actually a sophisticated endocrine organ. And it's literally our most important hormone. It orchestrates the activity of all other hormones in the body. And leptin is fundamentally a fat sensor. And I talk about this a lot more in both my books, Primal Body, Primal Mind, and Primal Fat Burner, which was just released by Simon & Schuster on January 24th. But once again, as Ice Age beings, we were basically designed to weather not just the cold, but extremes of climate. In other words, while extreme North America and extreme South America was basically covered in thousands of feet of ice and snow and all of that, Africa was being ripped apart by drought and wildfires. So, we were designed to, deal with extreme cold, extreme heat, drought, wildfires, floods, huge storms, and the effects of widespread volcanic activity occurring during these time periods, and these patterns sometimes lasting thousands of years. We became human, in essence, by surviving disasters.
Wow.
There would have been time periods and places, too, where plant life, particularly edible plant life, would have been pretty scarce and impractical as a meaningful source of calories. It's nutrient density that would have been of absolutely paramount and highly coveted importance. And there's nothing more nutrient and calorie dense than meat, and especially fat. I'm not saying that we all need to be eating slabs and slabs of meat and have our food swimming in fat, but your body is constantly leptin is looking for that signal that says hunting is good. And hunting is good when fat is sufficient. When fat is insufficient, your body becomes much better at synthesizing it from other things, namely carbohydrates in your diet, and causing your body to become stingier about letting it go. When there's enough fat,
is that why there's so much obesity in the world today?
It's one of many reasons why, and it's sort of interesting because there was a recent expose in the New York Times that basically that showed that it was in fact the sugar industry, an industry group called the Sugar Association, quote unquote, that secretly funded the so-called science designed to unjustly blame dietary fat for the growing crisis of ill health and obesity.
Wow.
This had apparently been going on since the early 60s. So I have a quote here, according to a CBS News report on the discovery. They said that, and I quote, "Once studies began emerging linking sugar with heart disease, according to documents that were dug up from public archives, the following year, the sugar industry approved what they called Project 226, which entailed paying Harvard researchers today's equivalent of $48,900 for an article reviewing the scientific literature, supplying materials they wanted reviewed, and receiving drafts of the article. The resulting article, published in 1967, concluded that there was, quote, no doubt that reducing cholesterol and saturated fat was the only dietary intervention needed to prevent heart disease. And the researchers overstated the consistency of the literature on fat and cholesterol while downplaying studies on sugar. According to the analysis, the sugar industry's funding and role were not disclosed when the article was published by the New England Journal of Medicine. Such disclosures were not required at the time. For decades afterwards, scientists and health officials focused almost entirely upon reducing fat and not sugar to prevent heart disease." And a guy by the name of Stanton Glantz, professor of medicine at the University of California in San Francisco, he was quoted in the New York Times expose as saying, "They were able to derail the discussion about sugar for decades." So
No, that's like unbelievable. I mean, it's believable because look at the cigarette industry, right? For years, they had doctors coming out and saying how, I smoke these because these are the best and all that kind of thing. So, nothing is shocking anymore. I mean, what's shocking is that it's still going on. It's shocking that somebody like you with this voice is not, all over the news and, it's still almost like these podcasts have to bring this information out when mainstream media I've never seen this or heard this on any of these mainstream stations. I mean, am I wrong or?
No, you're not going to. I mean, mainstream media is owned by about 5 different, corporate entities, many of which have big stakes in in this paradigm. I can't think of a single multinational interest, for instance, that wouldn't be heavily invested in every man, woman, and child on planet Earth being dependent on a carbohydrate-based diet because it's easy to produce, it's cheap as hell to produce, excuse my French.
And they're consistently needing more and more of it.
Well, right. And it's immensely profitable. You can't make a 5,000% profit on a grass-fed steak like you can a box of cereal.
Wow.
And not only that, but that type of diet basically keeps whoever consumes it perpetually hungry. Very nice for Monsanto, and Nabisco. Not so great for the rest of us.
No, I wonder, I was walking around the other day and I was looking at people and, I'm 54 years old. So I have 54 years of looking at people to judge by. But I thought, what would people look like if I could go back 100 years and see them walking around? Like in my 54 years, I've seen people just seem to look sadder than I remember them when I was in my teen years or, you know what I mean? They seem more depressed. They seem heavier.
It's not getting any better. Age 30 is the new 45, with respect to onsetting of disease today. And, this is it. It's really it's a cataclysmic finding. I mean, there's literally a study showing that age 30 has become the new 45 with respect to onsetting disease. It's all new, and not because we suddenly began consuming more animal-based foods and fats. We've been told for decades now to avoid animal source foods and fats and focus on a diet based in carbohydrates, all for the very first time in human history. And what have these dietary guidelines done for us? Well, there was a study published in May of 2015 that took a very close look at the actual impact of dietary guidelines on the health of U.S. citizens between the years of 1965 and 2011. And shockingly, the rates of obesity and numerous metabolic diseases during that time had increased dramatically. But the party line about why this was happening was basically that we were all just too dumb and lazy to follow the rules, right? If we just listened to the government, guidelines and decrees by medical authorities, whatever, we would all be doing so much better. But that's not what the study showed. Even more shockingly for some, not for me so much, but it clearly showed that Americans had been following the rules and diligently following government guidelines all along, to our collective and undeniable detriment. Our intake of carbohydrates dramatically and dutifully increased during this time period, while our intake of dietary animal fats substantially decreased, which of course were also replaced in part, naturally, by these so-called heart-healthy, soybean, canola, and other trash vegetable oils. And, vegetable oil industry.
There's a whole story behind that, right? There's a whole story behind that.
They were complicit in this whole thing, too. And it was like an unholy alliance between the sugar industry and the vegetable oil industry. I mean, back in the 1950s and 60s, margarine companies were advertising in the American Journal of Medicine. So, or a Journal of American Medical Association.
I remember as a kid getting from the commercials thinking margarine's the best thing for you and butter is horrible for you.
They say, I can't believe it's not butter. I sure can. But not that I really eat butter, but anyway, it's. But
what is it, Nora? Just going. You talked about soy a little bit like that. What about GMO, genetically modified foods? What foods are most hit with that? I know soy is probably one of those.
Soy and corn are almost entirely genetically modified. And a lot of crops are becoming genetically modified. They're starting actually now to genetically modify salmon. And Monsanto has, as their stated goal, the complete control of the world's food supply. And so
now, why would they do that? What's going on with this?
Why would anybody do anything? Follow the money. It's complete control. It's power and it's unlimited wealth. When you control and you have, they were granted back in the Papa Bush administration. They're basically granted the right to control and patent life. And so all of the seeds of the world that are, that are grown for food and whatever else, they immediately snapped up and claimed patents on, and squirreled those away so that they can kind of control what happens with those things. But when you genetically, you're genetically modifying.
Can you explain for the audience, what does that mean, genetically modifying? What does that actually mean? Like when you take a soybean or a corn and you genetically modify, what are you doing to it?
They're injecting, they're basically splicing genes together that were never meant to be spliced together. The genes of animals and plants and all kinds of things, even insects, in order to create basically a new form of life. And in theory, to select for certain characteristics that make the plant maybe easier to harvest or easier to grow in certain conditions and that kind of thing. But
so you're not talking about the old methods of like taking a branch of one and put it on the other so that it goes. I forget what they call it.
Which is
we're talking totally different
things like that.
Right.
Hybridization has its issues too, particularly with respect to grains. Because whenever we hybridize a plant, and this is a very different thing, by the way, but when we hybridize them, we're basically creating roughly 5% new proteins every time we do that. And the human immune system has to catch up to that. But the problem is we're not becoming more adapted to, for instance, these post-agricultural foods as time goes on. We're becoming less adapted as time goes on. And, for instance, the incidence of full-blown celiac disease has increased over 400% in the last 50 years alone.
Wow.
That's according to verifiable research, and not because we suddenly developed new testing or became more conscious of it. This was based on a study where they took 10,000 blood samples from 50 years ago compared to 10,000 blood samples for today. And using the exact same testing methods, and found that and those blood samples from 50 years ago were from, well-preserved military, samples.
Yeah. So it's sort of going back to my question a little bit was, if I were put in a time machine and went back 100, 150 years and I'm walking down the street, what would people look like compared to today?
They would look quite a bit different. I mean, that long ago, people were still using more animal fat to cook with, and that kind of thing. We weren't refining foods. We weren't as fat phobic, and there weren't as many processed foods around. So things would have been better than they are today, certainly.
Wow.
But, the thing to understand is that really the slippery slope started the day we adopted agriculture as a primary source of food, as our, primary basically basis for nourishment. And it's sort of interesting to point out that in the last 10,000 years since we did that, since we went from a diet that was basically 90% based in meat and especially the fat of animals in terms of our caloric intake, to maybe, 10, 15% or whatever now today, by comparison, we've actually lost just over 10% of our brain volume in the process.
Wow.
So evolution may not be heading in the direction we'd hoped.
Might not be going in the right direction.
Well, as evidenced, of course, by, reality TV and whatever else, and in our political climate, we're not getting smarter, folks.
My dad told me, I remember as a kid, he said that people were going to evolve to have just one big finger to push buttons on the TV remote. And I thought, man, he's pretty good. It was pretty
And all
true.
you need are, maybe two synapses holding hands in order to do that, which is kind of the direction things are going.
Oh, it's a little scary, I mean, for somebody listening to this, I mean, I'm sure we can go on and on about some of the things. I'd like to.
Yes.
The one thing that does strike me, I do want to touch on one more thing just to scare the heck out of everybody a little bit. But you talked about in your book Hexane being added to processed soy product. Can you talk about what Hexane is? And you also said that it's in baby foods.
It's a solvent, and it's used to extract certain nutrients from foods and things like that, and it ends up as a residue. And it's a toxic solvent. It's not nourishment, folks. And so a lot of seed oils and things like that are extracted in that manner. And the residues end up in foods. And, of course, what are we doing with baby foods among so many other things? We're starting those babies out with what? I've got to tell you first that we're literally born to function in a state of ketosis. Babies are born in a functional state of ketosis. They don't start craving carbs until we start feeding it to them.
Really?
Right. And so, look, we have a brain that's maybe 2 to 5% of our total body weight, right? Maybe a little less if you happen to be a politician or something.
Maybe a lot less.
But that brain takes up 20 to 25% of all your energy demands. That makes our brains really metabolically expensive. But get this, babies take 85%. Their brains take 85% of their metabolic demands. Young children, 45, 50%. So, and contrast this with, say, our closest primate relatives, their brains maybe occupy maybe 8% of their metabolic requirements. So
but
our
Nora, then
brains
go
are
along. I mean,
expensive.
I looked at some of the formula. Like I actually read the what's on it, and it was 90%. Maybe I'm misquoting it, but I remember reading something where it was almost 90% carbohydrates or sugars. Is that right?
Yes. And so this is, let's get conspiracy theorists for a moment here. Look, what the food companies are actually doing are cultivating this in babies. They're saying feed them mashed bananas and whatever, their amylase genes aren't even really online yet, but they're feeding them mashed bananas and all these kinds of things. And
now, a mashed banana, like a lot of people think that's healthy for you, right?
Right.
So it's not,
so look,
right?
The fruit of today, the fruit that you see in the cultivated fruit you see in the grocery stores is so different for the most part from the kind of stuff that would have been available to our primitive hunter-gatherer ancestors. And think about it. Wild fruit, it tends to be smaller, less sweet, it doesn't always tend to be less sweet. Sometimes it can be very sweet, but it's much more fibrous, oftentimes tart, and seasonally available. Not 24/7, 365 days a year. And so today, fruit is not cultivated for its nutritional content. It's cultivated for its size and its sweetness. And by the way, fructose, which is the primary sugar found in fruit, is actually a sugar that is designed that when we consume it. Now, this would have been conferred an evolutionary advantage to people living in a harsh and unpredictable environment, especially in the late summer when fruit ripens, right? We have this taste for this stuff because it flips a switch in us called fructokinase. It's an enzyme that triggers your brain to start. It's a signal to your brain that says start storing fat and start storing it now. That allows us to allow our ancestors to go into a mild state of insulin resistance prior to winter so they could put on insulation and padding and have a little extra, energy supply,
So storage, basically.
in lean times. Right. Yeah. Obviously today, I don't care if you're living in Minnesota in February when it's 40 below outside. Winter ain't coming for us anymore. We're living in these 72 degree, comfortable environments, sitting on the couch watching Netflix and ordering pizzas, And yet we still have a taste for these foods that flip the same switch in us. And, it's another reason why obesity is such a rampant problem.
Nora, let me ask you, as we wind down here a little bit, I always ask the question, what is the holy grail of health? So I'm going to pose that to you. Like, if I were to say to you, Nora, what would you consider for our audience the holy grail of health, and how could they achieve it?
A diet basically based in what is absolutely most evolutionarily natural and genetically compatible with us. And that is a diet basically that minimizes sugar and starch. It's not required, and it triggers insulin, and it does all kinds of bad things, and it causes us to age prematurely and everything else. So it's a no-brainer. Leave it out, right, to the extent possible.
Sure.
You can eat as many fibrous vegetables and greens as you want because that has a very low glycemic impact, and I think those foods are actually more important to us now than they used to be for a variety of reasons. To help detox, to phytonutrients, antioxidants.
Give an example of a couple, like maybe spinach, lettuce.
Spinach, lettuce, broccoli, asparagus. Brussels sprouts and, cabbage, brassica vegetables and things like that, a whole variety of greens, things that don't turn to sugar when we consume them, like potatoes and root vegetables. Raw carrots are kind of okay in certain amounts, although I wouldn't be juicing them. But when you cook them, it becomes a sugar bomb, right?
Wow.
You can raise your blood sugar faster with a baked potato than you can with a candy bar.
Wow.
So we need to minimize that. Then you moderate your protein intake. It must sound to a lot of people listening to this like I'm talking about eating a lot of meat. I'm not. we don't need more than 6 or 7 ounces a day. And part of what I do in evaluating all of this is I also look at human longevity research to figure out how we can combine these fundamental principles, which I think are an essential starting place, with what science actually tells us is going to help us live longer and healthier. And anything that minimizes insulin, number one, is going to, you're going to live longer and be healthier by far. But also, we need to keep protein to just what we need. We need complete protein from animal source foods. That triggers, and that we don't have time to talk about why, but we do. And I talk about it in my books plenty. But,
Laura, let me
but we don't need more than just to meet those requirements. If we exceed those requirements, we have, you can also trigger aging and make yourself more susceptible to cancer. It's not good. So moderate your protein intake and let fat make up the rest of the calories and food quality has to be the foundational basis of your food choices. Get your meat only from animals fed exclusively upon grass, upon what was natural for them to forage upon. In the wild, for instance,
right.
And you're going to get fat and all these fat soluble nutrients. It's not just about macronutrients; it's about all these other nutrients in a balanced form that it takes the guesswork out of it. And so that's basically
what about fish?
The formula.
What about fish?
It's, so seafood is sort of the darling of the health industry. And 10, 15 years ago, I would have been, it's awesome. It can be awesome. I offer a couple of sources for seafood that I think are great in my book, but there aren't that many. Our oceans are dangerously contaminated in ways that are not being talked about in the media. And so I caution
You're talking
people,
also about like Fukushima, still the radiation leaked out of that.
The reactors that melted down, three reactors just melted down. They're still melting down. That goes on forever. They're dumping 2,000 tons of highly radioactive waste into the Pacific every day and have been since 2011. These radioactive plumes have now reached the West Coast. There is ample evidence, and I've uncovered that this has reached now the seafood supply. And we don't know what is contaminated and what isn't because the FDA and the government have refused to test anything. And by the way, the reactors that melted down were designed by General Electric. General Electric owns NBC. And
I think all the reactors in this country are pretty much the same.
Well, right. And you got one up by you in New York that's pretty similar, as I recall, to the ones that had not such a happy ending in Japan. So, we have to realize that there are vested interests in kind of killing these stories after a while, burying them under. And a lot of people, most people, it seems in the street, think all this stuff just, that's old news, isn't it? No. No.
It's still going. It's still going.
So it's really, and the other thing to realize is that, for instance, in Japan, where they are understandably a little bit touchy about radioactivity, they have actually much stricter laws than we do about what is allowed in terms of radionuclides and whatever in their foods. And they don't allow more than like 20 becquerels per kilogram or something like that. So when the fishermen are fishing off the coast of Fukushima and they reel these fish in and they're glowing in the dark, what they can't sell to their own people, they sell to us because we don't have those same limits on what's allowed there. And, the State Department in the, last administration, just agreed that they were not going to limit the importation of food and goods or whatever that might be contaminated because, you see, that'd be too economically inconvenient. So this stuff ends up in the fish counters and whatever else. I'm very nervous about seafood. I love it. I'm a little more comfortable eating if I travel to the Southern Hemisphere and something's fresh caught off the coast of Tasmania or something like that.
Wow.
But
Nora, that's unbelievable. I have to tell you, I'm really excited that we're doing this show because I'm learning so much just with amazing guests like yourself, and it gets crazier and crazier as we do these things.
It makes me sound nuts or extreme or something, but I'm telling you,
you don't actually. Like, the truth of the matter is, I've done my own research, and you don't sound extreme at all. Unfortunately,
right. The extreme is in the conditions that that we're living under, and in the marketplace, and what it is we're forced to accept as "quote unquote" food. And so.
Well, Nora, people want to get in touch with you or find out more about you. How would they do that?
Well, I would direct for my most current book, which, is doing extremely well, right now, you can go to primalfatburner.com. I also have a new educational program. That's a weekly educational program. If you're a nutritional therapist, you can get CEU credits, actually. And it's called Primal Power 52, because for 52 weeks of the year, each week of the year, you're getting a really, really good nutritional education in ways that you're not probably going to get anywhere else. I also have my other website, primalbody-primalmind.com, where I have fairly extensive blog and a lot of other information and some free podcasts and videos and things like that you can peruse. So there you
Nora,
go.
I want to thank you so much for being on the show. It was incredible.
Thanks,
at some point, we'd love to have you back. Thank you again.
I'd love to be back. Thank you so much. You've been great.
No, it's been great. My pleasure.
This episode is sponsored by New Jersey Foot and Ankle Center in Oradell, New Jersey. Remember, when you have a foot problem, you've got a foot doctor in the family. Weekend and evening appointments are available. Call us at 201-261-9445. Once again, that's 201-261-9445. Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes over at drdanspeaks.com. If you're loving the show, head over to iTunes and leave us a review, and we'll catch you next time. Voiceovers for this episode were provided by Randy Ramos Jr. To see and hear more of his work, visit randyramosjr.com. jr.com.